if you want to know your personal brand, hide a microphone in a room and see after you leave what people say about you. Because your personal brand is your reputation. It's your integrity. It's what you stand for. It's your values. It's what you're willing to make a stand for.
Yeah.
Because anything else is a contrivance.
Yes.
It's not authentic. It's not real.
Yeah.
Step into the world of success with Your Brand Amplified, the ultimate podcast designed to unravel the intricacies of thriving businesses. I'm your host, Annika Jackson, and I'm on a mission to uncover the stories, strategies, and secrets that have propelled entrepreneurs and business leaders to success.
It is truly an honor and a pleasure to bring B. Jeffrey Madoff to Your Brand Amplified today. We've had multiple conversations, and honestly, if I hadn't pushed record, we probably would have run out of time to have this interview because it's always such a treat and a privilege and an honor to speak to you. So thank you, first and foremost, for coming on the show and giving me your time today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And after that lovely introduction, I'm not going to say anything else because I don't want to screw up a good first impression.
Well, I've been really interested in the pursuit of innovation and creativity in everything we do. How we bring it to artistic pursuits, but also other professional pursuits, whether it's big organizations and how they incorporate those aspects. And I will say that you are creative at heart, and everything that you've done has helped infuse our world with a little more intellect, a little more creativity. And so I want to start with your beginning. Because when I look at you, I see a through line, and it really inspires me to continue on all of the different journeys that I want to go on. So let's start at that beginning. Before you moved to New York, before you worked in production, ad agencies, did all of the other pursuits, fashion design, all of the things that you've brought to the world.
Well, the story starts as the air gets wavy and the calendar pages fall off. I was born in Akron, Ohio, and my parents were always very supportive of the things that I did. Because very early on, I used to draw constantly and make up stories. So I would write short stories. I would draw. My parents had retail stores, so they would bring home large sheets of craft paper so that I could draw on them or do whatever I wanted. And my room was kind of my space where I could do whatever I wanted in my room. And so it's kind of a free play space. And I have an older sister. She's 4 years older than I, and she loved playing teacher. So by the time I entered kindergarten, I was reading on a third grade level.
Amazing.
And, because my sister loved playing teacher, my parents bought her a blackboard, and so she would basically teach me what she had learned in school that day. And it was, I think, got me into some habits and possibly even developmentally, because I was starting at that time, there was so little awareness of, how do you spark a kid's brain and, how do you get them engaged and involved? And I was really lucky that by accident, really, that happened. And so I was always writing stories. I was always drawing. I did comic strips that were passed around the school, always doing those kinds of things that I really, really enjoyed. And I think that gave me a certain confidence because that behavior was reinforced by my folks.
Yeah.
They really liked that. And fortunately, my sister really enjoyed teaching me to read when I was really young. And it's just, I just kind of absorbed all this stuff. And so I've always been a stimulus junkie. That's why I live in New York City. I mean, I just love that.
So yes, you live in New York. You started in Ohio. We were talking before we jumped on that you went to school in Wisconsin.
Yes. University of Wisconsin in Madison.
Yeah. And you double majored as well.
Yes, I did. I had a double major, and it just kind of worked out that way because I had completed my philosophy degree by my junior year because I took very heavy credit loads. And the other courses that I really enjoyed was psychology. And the interesting thing is that philosophy and psychology used to be the same discipline. And that changed in 1932. And what changed that was Sigmund Freud was asked to write the entry for this new field called psychology in the Encyclopedia Britannica. So that forever split the two disciplines into philosophy and psychology. And I found both fascinating because I like thinking about thinking and reflective thinking. And there weren't any right or wrong answers. It's how well you could support through critical thinking and being logical, what your ideas were or what ideas you wanted to put forth. And I think that just, helped influence me quite a bit. And I had nothing like that in my earlier schooling. History was a textbook that was a bore, that was basically just learning dates, but you never understood what the significance really was aside from the headline. And this was something that just so opened my mind to so many areas. It was just, and I was so ripe for that kind of exploration, which I pursue with the same enthusiasm now that I had over 50 years ago.
Yeah. So how do you get from philosophy and psychology into becoming a fashion designer? I mean, a producer,
You don't see the logical
a playwright, being a multi-time author, podcaster.
No, I thought it was an obvious path. I was working in this boutique in Madison, and it was owned by a guy who was only a few years older than me. And it was a cool little store. We could do what we wanted, and I did the buying for it. And my parents were in retail. My sister is still in retail.
Oh.
So I knew some things about that business. So I was able to get the job. And I graduated from college early. And I got a call from a dear friend of mine that his mother and my mother grew up together. And Kenny Meerman called me up and said, look, he graduated from college a year before me. And he said, I saved up some money can you think of a gig that would earn more than bank interest? I said, well, I see what we sell in this store. I could always draw. I'll design clothes. And he said, okay. And he sent me a check for the most money I had ever had at one time. I think it was $1,500. He thinks it was $2,500, but not much money, but seemed like a lot, So I sketched some things. I was extremely naive. When I went to buy fabrics, if the fabric was on the bolt, I thought, oh, that's wholesale. It hasn't been made into anything yet. But no, that wasn't wholesale. That was just retail fabric. And so I really learned by doing, which I think is the best way to learn anyhow. Not necessarily true if you're a pulmonary surgeon, but for things in the arts, I think it's a great way to learn. So it happened really by accident. I had some things, I designed some things, picked out the fabrics, tore apart a shirt that I liked to see what are the pieces? How does this even made? I liked the fit. So I wanted to replicate that fit. And there were some people that did alterations for the clothing in the stores. And I asked them if they would sew, these prototypes essentially. And we put them in the store and they sold out quickly, really quickly. Made some more stuff that sold out. And then I put together, about, 20 designs, strapped them on a suitcase on the back of my motorcycle, drove from Madison, Wisconsin to Chicago, Illinois, went to 18 boutiques, sold 15 of them. And all of a sudden I had like $35,000 worth of orders and had no idea how I was even going to manufacture the clothes.
Oh my gosh.
And I had learned enough that I went to the stores and looked at who the fabric was from that I was buying. They had offices in Chicago. And most of them, my hair, I had hair then, and it was like your length of hair. And, didn't look like I had any money or was a viable business person. But there was a really nice salesman who said to me, "Who's going to make your clothes? Do you have a contractor?" And I said, "I don't think so. What's a contractor?" And that's a place that will make your clothing for you. I got a guy. Let me call this guy and see if he'll meet with you. And he's in upstate Wisconsin. So that was my first introduction. As when I say I learned as I was going, it's like, the phrase that you're building the airplane while it's flying. This was kind of it. And I drove to Montello, Wisconsin, and this guy standing on the front porch, cigarette hanging down. And to him, I was one of those hippies,
Yep.
And super nice man. And he said, "All right, let's see what you got." We went inside on one of the big cutting tables. That was the first time I've ever seen a cutting table. And he picks up the clothes, looks how it's made, and he said, "You sold this shit?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "People bought this?" And I said, "Yeah." "Give me an idea. How much do you have in orders?" I said, "Now I have about 55,000. Dollars?" "Yeah." Just, "With me making your stuff, you're going to make $1 million." And he was a great guy and became a mentor to me. I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know what I was really tackling, but if I'm interested in something, I can figure it out. If I'm not interested, unscrewing a jar becomes complicated.
Yeah. I feel that very deeply because I'm the same person. So I know we definitely, I could talk to you and ask you questions for hours and we still wouldn't be able to pull your entire story and journey out. So what I'm hearing though, and I think this is something that still works today, is that you had a lot of interest areas and you were open to the process. And by being open, I think that's when ideas and intuition come in and then kind of help you find the right people to go on whatever this path is that you're going to pursue, whether it's what you intended to do or not. And so clearly this happened in the course of this work. And, there are other kinds of business where you probably, your oil, construction, engineering, you probably have to have things a little more buttoned up. And you probably have a little bit of a different type of brain to do that versus many entrepreneurs and multi-passionate people, right? Just leave ourselves open and then things happen and things are offered to us that we didn't even know were possible. And we keep going down that line. And I see that how it's unfolded in your life with this business, because then you did become a top 10 fashion designer. What was the name of your brand? Where did that take you before you said, "I'm ready to try something new and put my energy somewhere else"?
Well, the name of the company was Billy Whiskers Clothing Company. And I was chosen one of the top 10 designers, as you just said, but I want to be clear. I think there were only 8 of us at the time. So it wasn't so hard to be in the top 10. Young people starting a startup, they didn't call them startups. And the young person starting a business then was, unusual. And so people who like this fabric salesman, like Jerry, who helped me and manufactured the stuff for me initially and helped me find additional factors because we were like doubling every 4 months. I was very fortunate that I also learned who to trust, not without making some mistakes and not without being taken advantage of and that sort of thing. But I learned, and fortunately, those lessons that I learned, I was doing enough business that I could keep moving through the mistakes, learning from them, correcting and moving forward. But it was, I got to a point where I wanted to be in New York all the time. And my financial backer, who was a terrific person, he was a lawyer and he was 5th generation Wisconsinite. And I think his parents must have come over with the Pilgrims or something. I don't know. But I was a novelty to him, but we liked each other. And he liked the fact that I had 120 employees and we all banked at his bank. That was part of the condition. And he said to me that if you ever leave Wisconsin, I'm not going to continue to back you. And, because I'm backing you because you are providing jobs here. And I never thought I'd want to leave, but I did. I did want to leave. It became too small for me and for what my ambitions and desires were, and that New York was just, such an amazing, exciting place, although going through very hard times in the 1970s when I moved here. And I guess, meeting people, seeing what's possible, trying things and realizing that, risk is both part of the fun and a necessary condition if you want to do something creative or original, or even just start a business.
Right.
And I was very well suited to that because my mom and dad were entrepreneurs. My sister's an entrepreneur. So it was never my desire, I hope I get a good job. It was like, what do I want to do? And then I'd figure out how to do it.
Yeah. So you said, all right, I am going to have to leave. I'm going to go to New York and try, hang my shingle there. Did you know what you were going to do when you moved to New York? Did you still hold on to the fashion company and try to manage it when you were moving?
No, I did not. We negotiated a separation, and I had enough money saved up that if I lived frugally, which I did, I traveled the world for about a year and lived in a bunch of different places in New York to learn the city. Because back then you could do like apartment sitting. You didn't even have to pay rent. These people would be going on a trip for a month and they'd want somebody to take in their mail and, do that sort of thing. And so I got to learn the city in a good way. I then started another clothing company, built that up and sold it. And as I did that, I transitioned into doing film work, which then became film and video, and found something there that I felt that I could do forever because it was creative and storytelling and all the kinds of things that I liked and all the things that I had done even in my earlier iterations of business, and was working with, I'll name drop here, but Dennis Hopper and William Burroughs. And there was a very interesting kind of an interlude, and met some people that bridged me into the film world. And so, I did that. And while I had my production company, I started teaching at Parsons School of Design, taught a course called Creative Careers, Making a Living with Your Ideas, which was basically what I've done my whole. And it was a great class because it gave me license, just like I ended up here talking to you. It gave me license to, approach people that I was interested in and say, I'd love to interview you for my class. And Parsons has a good name and reputation, so that helped be a magnet also. And I love doing that, which I then sort of parlayed that into a book of the same name, then transitioned into theater. And so it's always been about what excites me. What do I want to do? And I think it's really important when you look back and you understand what lit you up when you were a kid. What lit me up was storytelling, was a kind of creative direction. Movies. I had a movie theater in my basement I did when I was like 12 years old, where I would rent films. I could go downtown Akron and buy candy wholesale, and I would sell it there, design the posters and put them around the neighborhood. And every Saturday there'd be 20 kids who would come to our basement and they'd see movies. And I was doing sound mixing. I used my sister's stereo, and I had a tape recorder. And so I would make sound effects and the sound tracks because the movies were silent, and created this theater, which I had for a couple months in the summer. But all the things that I love doing, I still love doing. And so I've always looked for things that I find gratifying or exciting or fun, and figure out how can I, the ideal thing to me is making money doing what you love doing, because there's inevitably going to be struggle and difficulty and obstacles to overcome and all of that. And I think you can weather a lot more heartache if what you're working towards is something that means a lot to you.
Is there a time that you had to, step into something that you felt a little bit less comfortable doing just to get to the next stage in your path? Because I think it's been what we're hearing, right, is that you've been able to embark on this journey where you've been able to pursue these creative entities make a living doing them. And I think there are a lot of people who instead were told, go to school, get a good job. They work in an office, even though it's might not be their dream. And then they get down the path a little bit. And I think we're seeing this a lot now, particularly post-pandemic. People are more intentional about how they work, where they work, what they do, what the values of a company versus their own personal values. And so I think people are waking up and trying to get to the point that you've lived in, right? And exuded for the rest of us to follow.
Yeah, I don't think we yet know, as a result of the pandemic, which had seismic change in my life. I decided to devote all of my time to my play, Personality, because with the exception of making a feature film, I had done everything else. I did commercials, I did documentaries, I did TV specials. I did all of that, music videos, all those things, which I loved doing, and it was great fun. And I had a great career doing that stuff. But then when I did a documentary about Lloyd Price, who's the subject of my play, and learned about his life, I decided I wanted to do this as a theater piece. And it was a whole new world I had to learn about.
Wow.
But it was fascinating to me. And, and I loved it. And I am fueled by curiosity and passion. Those are the things that really fuel me. And people would say to me, well, is this a commercial project or a passion project? And my answer was yes. Why do I have to choose? Why can't it be both?
Right.
And if I'm able to find the financial backing, if I'm able to attract the right talents and investors, why not go for those things that are audacious dreams? Why not? And and things change. You get married, you have kids, you've got to provide for others. It's not just about yourself. If you're going to house sit at 11 different places in a year, you can't do that where it doesn't usually work anyhow, I'm sure, when you've got a spouse and you've got kids. And, my primary responsibility is supporting my family. But fortunately, I've been able to do that. I have certainly taken lots of hits along the way and made mistakes, did all kinds of things that, it's a mistake on one hand, it's a learning experience.
Right.
On the other hand, it still hurts. And you don't want those things that really give you those body blows, but hopefully your first mistake is the smallest and you learn from that. So you don't do that again, but I never had a desire to do one thing for the rest of my life. I'm thinking I get out of college, 21 years old or so. How the hell do you know what you want to do for the rest of your life?
Right. And
the first 18 years, you spent 14 of them in school. And if you went to preschool, even more. And so, I wanted to live and get out there in a way that I figured, why not? I mean, now as I'm older, my mantra is, if not now, when? But I always felt like taking those kinds of calculated risks and creative chances, that's what always excited me. And that's what I always loved doing.
Well, and to this day, you've had your production company for over 40 years. You've been a professor at Parsons for over 20 years.
Well, 16 years, yeah.
16? Okay. You have written a book. You've, like you said, kind of done it all. And now you've turned to, you still have those two things. You are in the midst of another book with Dan Sullivan. You have a podcast with Dan Sullivan. And you also have become a playwright.
Yes.
So you're still multi-talented, multi-passionate, still pursuing all these things. How do they all fit together?
Well, I guess I'm the hub. And each of those things are spokes off of that hub of things that I want to do. I'm a big believer in everything you do informs everything else you do. Mm-hmm. So what I mean by that is I had a paper route. So that's a pursuit that doesn't exist anymore. But I had a paper route. Well, what did I have to do for my paper route? I had a territory that was mine. I bought the newspapers wholesale. sold them at retail, had to deliver the product on a daily basis, and I had to get paid once a month. So I had to go to each of the accounts and get paid, because if I didn't get paid, I didn't make any money. And so I learned how to buy wholesale, sell retail, keep track of here's how much money I've got coming in, here's how much money I've got going out. And so I learned a tremendous amount that affected how I did business, or taught me how to do business. So by the time I started my clothing company, it was a much bigger line of tasks to do, come up with an idea, sketch it out, cost out the fabric, cost out the labor, how long will it take to make it, sell it, collect the money, all that kind of stuff, which is just like producing a film, which is just like producing a play. I mean, there's much more in common than there is different. So it's not like I'm a spinal surgeon and I'm a film director, although that could be interesting. I have another idea. But the point is that I think that there are through lines to what I did. And I think if anybody sort of paused and thought about, so what are the skills that I've learned? What do I know how to do? How can I apply them to this, which I'd really like to do? Now I know the title of your podcast is Your Brand Amplified. Is that right?
Yes.
Tell me what that means, because branding is part of what I do.
Right. Well, it's funny because sometimes people think it's just about branding, and I'm like, no, it's really about the essence of you. So when I have somebody on, sometimes we'll just talk about business, but I always want to bring out the person behind it. Right. And that's why it's always so fascinating when we talk, because I always learn, and I'm always jotting down a number of different books that I need to look up and resources. And because I want to hear about the person behind the brand or brands, the pivots, the decisions you made, the highs, the lows, what led you from one area to the next. Because I've had a very nonlinear career of where, as you mentioned earlier, things change. I took time off to be at home with my daughter. Things changed again. I got divorced. I had to find full-time work instead of just volunteer work and part-time and family businesses. But in that, right, I think it's been a great discovery, because I've been able to pursue different areas that I had no idea at this time in my life that I'd be teaching university, podcasting, consulting, creating courses for the university, thinking about getting my doctorate, all of these different things that I do. But and like you, I see the connection, even if other people don't always see that connection. So that's why I ask, because I love to see, how you continue to be inspired. Like, what inspired you to create personality?
What inspired me to create personality was I was hired to produce and direct a documentary about the singer Lloyd Price. Lloyd is one of the founding fathers of rock and roll. His first song, Lawdy Miss Clawdy, was a cornerstone song of rock and roll. Some consider it the cornerstone song of rock and roll, but that's subjective. There's a lot of discussion about that, but he was a major influence in that world. And one of the other things that happened is in 1952, when Lawdy Miss Clawdy, his first song, was released, at that time, if you wanted to buy a record by a black artist, you had to go to a black-owned record store. Lloyd was black. If you wanted to get on a jukebox, it had to be on a black-owned jukebox company. So there was lots of restrictions for blacks, who were really the foundation of rock and roll. Two of the endemic American musics are jazz and rock, and those were black musicians who started that and created that form. So when I did the documentary about Lloyd, I knew some of his music, but I didn't know anything about him. And I had been approached by a man who was the executive producer of Radio City Music Hall. I had done a film that was the 75th anniversary of Radio City and the story of the Rockettes and all that. And he liked my work a lot. He and I became friends. He left Radio City, and he was at his eye doctor's, and another one of the people in the waiting room was Lloyd Price.
Well,
and so John called me and said, that's how this stuff happens, though, You can plan all the introductions you want, but it's serendipity so often that ignites something. And John said, could Lloyd and I come over to your studio after our appointment? I said, sure. And Lloyd and I really hit it off. And so doing the research to do the documentary I was hired to do, and then interviewing Lloyd, I realized what an incredible life this guy had. And I wanted to tell his story. I thought it was a story that's important to be told. So and it has all of the things that fascinate me. It's about music, which I love. It's about popular culture, which I find fascinating. It's about race and human rights. There are so many crossroads in this thing that are so interesting to me that, one of the things Dan Sullivan says, to quote him and give him his credit, he said, what I like about what you're doing is that your future is always bigger than your past. And this is the biggest thing that I've done, and the most involving in a lot of ways. And again, if not now, when?
Right.
And so I love doing it. I love what I've learned, but that's how that came about. When I was able to attract additional financing, I was financing a film I was going to direct. I wrote it and I was going to direct it. When this came about, I actually went to my backers. I hadn't made that much money yet. And I said, I really want to switch gears and not do this screenplay, but do a play about Lloyd and put together kind of a synopsis of what it was and so on. And fortunately, enough people liked the idea that I was able to raise money. And like any entrepreneurial venture, each threshold you cross, you got to raise more money to get bigger and your reach, all of that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to seeing it. If anybody's listening, where would they be able to see it in the future? We know London.
Yes. London is where our next production is. We had runs outside of Philadelphia, in Chicago, in New York, our workshop, and then in two showcases in London. And we're going back to London and hope to have an extended run there. So that's going on. But I am curious.
Yeah. Back
to your brand, Amplified.
Yes.
Because this is something I'm asked a lot because I've done lots of brand work. And so I find the question that I'm asked the most is, how do you create a personal brand? And I've been at some panel discussions, and then I've been a keynote speaker. And my answer, which doesn't often thrill the people, is that my feeling is that personal brand is bullshit. That if you want to know your personal brand, hide a microphone in a room and see after you leave what people say about you. Because your personal brand is your reputation. It's your integrity. It's what you stand for. It's your values. It's what you're willing to make a stand for.
Yeah.
Because anything else is a contrivance.
Yes.
It's not authentic. It's not real.
Yeah.
Now, your business can have a brand, Walt Disney's Family Entertainment. That's what their brand stands for. And that's good. Apple is hip innovation, but for an individual, you are all you've got. And I think that reputation is so important.
Yes.
And accountability for what it is you do is so important. And I think that's what a personal brand is. And that often leads to interesting discussion because, everybody's trying to construct that, but that's artificial,
Yeah.
I just need to toss that in.
Well, that's my viewpoint, is that everything has to start with a person. And Your Brand Amplified started out because I had a PR firm and I had a lot of small clients come to me who hadn't really looked at their brand, how they're presenting themselves. They just had this business and logo and maybe a website. And so I would take a step back and say, okay, but let's talk about your vision, your mission, your purpose, your values, how that rolls into the messaging and how you take that to the world. And that turned into, more recently in the last few years, I did a personal brand workshop at Red Bull to talk about their brands and themselves as people and how it tuned into the brand of Red Bull, but also doing some further work on what that looked like for the future of work for them inside or outside of the company to sure that they are really in tune with their passion areas, their skill areas, right? That ikigai. And PR and branding courses that I've taught at USC. And now I kind of incorporate it into everything in terms of if you know yourself, right? To thine own self be true. If you know yourself really well, you know your values, then it's much easier to look at things and say yes or no. And it's not always easy to turn down money from a job that you think is going to be a great fit. And then you realize that it's not, that maybe the values that they bring to the table or the way they treat people or other things are different than what you anticipated. And I'm one of those people who will walk away, whether I have a backup plan or not. But I know that's not always easy. But I think if you know who you are, it's a lot easier not to get yourself in those situations. And so now when I'm talking to mostly university students about this, I'm really trying to help them and spark something in them, going back to one of your first words, right? That helps them live in that zone of their genius, their passion, their values, what change they want to see in the world. So when I talk about Your Brand Amplified, I look at it from, yes, let's talk about businesses. Let's talk about the brands, let's talk about what you can do to make your business better, but also let's talk about why it's more important to make sure that you're a good person, that you know what your understanding of success is, that's not everybody else's version necessarily. And that can steep you in living in that full purpose, mission, vision, values, brand.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is what's your criteria? What are the things that influence your decisions?
Right. Yeah.
And, I think that's really important, especially if you're a business leader. What does your company stand for? And what are you willing to walk away from when you're in a negotiation? What's most important to you? Because we are all marvelous at rationalizing bad decisions. Yeah. But I think if you set up your own compass, so to speak, and do some self-reflection in terms of what it is you're doing, why you are doing it, what do you bring to it that's unique, what aren't you willing to do, all of those things, is that self-reflection, I think, is of paramount importance. Because I don't know that you can achieve whatever you consider success to be. You don't have to build a big business to be successful. I mean, my belief is that the integrity and the sustainability of the relationships that I have, that's the true currency in life, is that. And so, as you said, to thine own self be true, but you share who that is. You don't hide it. This is what makes you unique.
Yeah.
What makes what you do valuable. It's interesting when you see there's been a rebirth, and this happens a lot with Streetcar Named Desire, directed by Elia Kazan, which launched Marlon Brando's career.
Yeah.
And the guy that just starred in Gladiator just starred in, another reboot of Streetcar Named Desire. Well, the thing that's really interesting is there's been a number of productions of that. And what some people did, who weren't good actors necessarily, were kind of to bring the qualities that Brando brought to that part. When in fact, what's going to make it work is finding within yourself those characteristics of personality, because you're doing another interpretation of it. You're not doing the same thing. Whatever it is you're offering, if you can bring in what's uniquely you to that mix, that's what's going to help make something successful. And a lot of people are afraid to put themselves out there, when in fact, that's their strongest asset.
Could not agree more. And that actually pretty well sums up what I see as my purpose, right? I have really found a love, particularly just a little story. Last week was last week was the last week, I should say, of the quarter of the spring term in terms of teaching. And this time more than ever, my students said, wow, this course has been the best course I've taken in this program so far. They opened up their minds in new ways. We talked about things in ways that they hadn't thought of. And this class was about licensing content, producing content, Do you use green screen? Do you use Unreal? Do you engine? What kind of technologies can you do? Where are you going to showcase, your content? Is it going to be streaming? Is it going to be linear? Is it going to be in an app? All these different questions that will help them think about digital media and managing whatever their outcome is going to be. But we talked a lot about broadband. We talked a lot about people having or not having technologies. We talked a lot about inequities in film, or how you can infuse access into filmmaking and production in terms of, if you're using, Indigenous people, are you having people on set who can tell you, yes, these are the names we would use. This is the right dress for that time period. These are the ways we would do ritual, right? Are you being inclusive? And so, but we also added accessibility and talked about the things that you need to do to infuse in your content to do that. So it was that just gave me another bout of enthusiasm, right? That I'm doing the right thing. And then it made me go, gosh, this is really in line with me trying to make sure that I'm leaving this world eventually, having helped people figure out what they're really passionate about, figure out how to be a change, how to use their voices to create that change, and not just be the quiet person in the room who's not willing to ask the hard questions if they are in a situation where somebody needs to stand up. So it's easier said than done, right? But it's really fantastic to see that, right? And to kind of say, okay, this is continuation of that journey. And I think everything that you've done has been a continuation of that journey for yourself, and saying, oh, I want to shine a light on this person, on Lloyd Price and his story that not very many of us know about this in this time, right? And it's a story that needs to be told right now, particularly with everything that's going on in the world. So you mentioned Dan Sullivan. So that takes me a little bit to, how did you decide to write a book with Dan Sullivan? How did you decide to have a podcast with him? And how does that also fuel your creativity and innovation?
Going back to like 1995 or 6, something like that. So how long? Almost 30 years ago or so. This is funny. I'll take a step back. There used to be a newsletter called Bottom Line. It was the biggest and most successful financially newsletter, no sponsorship, only by subscription. They had no ads, so they could do whatever they wanted. My mom had bought me a subscription to it, and it was perfect bathroom reading, and my subscription had run out. I was working late. I called to renew my subscription. This guy who answers on the other end said, I don't normally do this. Oh, let me help you out. I said, oh, thank you. Give me your name, please. And I give him my name, and there's a silence. And then he says, Jeff Madoff from Akron, Ohio. And I said, yeah. He said, Firestone High School? Yeah. He said, this is Kenny Glickman. I hadn't seen Kenny for 15 years or 20 years. And we talked for like 2.5 hours. And I had no idea where he was living. I didn't know anything. He had graduated a couple of years before me. So anyhow, he said towards the end of the conversation, I've got a good friend coming in from Arizona, coming to New York. His name is Joe Polish. And I'd love you two to meet. He's never been to New York before. Would you mind meeting him? I said, I'd be happy to meet him. And I don't know if you know Joe Polish. His business is called Genius Network. A very good guy. And through Joe, I met Dan some years later. And Dan and I would go in for Genius Network, and I would interview Joe's key guests, and I would interview them. One of those people is Dan, who kind of mentored Joe, and they have a very good relationship. And Dan and I kind of hit it off. So each year we'd make sure that we had lunch together at the event, and he'd come into New York with his wife, Babs, who's terrific. And they'd call me up for dinner or lunch or something. And we slowly built a relationship. And then at one point, Dan said to me, we should do a podcast together. We talk about anything and everything. And I think it'd be fun. Do you want to do it? Sure. Because we always enjoy talking to each other and just where our conversations would go. And calling it anything and everything gave us the big enough playground. We're always within that topic because it's anything and everything. So we did that, and we had been doing that for about 1.5 or 2 years. And Dan said to me, you've always hired crews when you were putting together your film crews, and you always had these great teams. And now with the play, you put together a great creative team, you're casting these actors and all of this. How do you go about hiring? And I said, actually, I believe in casting, not hiring. But, that's a book. And so we did a series of interviews. He had it put into like a short form paperback book, about 40 pages or so. And then he sold it to a publisher. And he said, I want you to write it. And we'll do this together. And Dan and Babs are investors in my play. And we've become very close. They're wonderful, wonderful people. And it all was, again, that serendipity. And the reason that I went back all the way back to Ken and how that led to meeting Joe, that led to meeting, that's how stuff happens.
Yeah.
So I believe if you have it, and just like you've introduced me to a couple of people, who knows? It could be, maybe, I think at the very least, it'll be a nice conversation, could lead to something else. Who knows? But I think being open enough, because so many people, I think, write the script beforehand. They think they're not good enough and they don't want to meet the person because they're whatever. A lot of people almost everybody sets up their own obstacles that they have to overcome. And to me, it's just, I'm kind of yes, and then yes, and, and so how do you keep moving things forward? So I went through that kind of longer answer just because there's just the different people along the way. And then you end up meeting somebody else and it sparks into a whole other thing. So now I'm doing a podcast and we're doing a book together.
Yeah.
Who knew? I didn't know. We just knew we enjoyed talking to each other and having lunch together, So I think it's really important to be open because you never, ever know. And if there's something you're doing, put it out there. Don't keep what you hope to do a secret because you'll never know. Oh, I have this friend that's very into theater. You should meet them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe that person doesn't do anything, but they introduce you to somebody else. You and I had in our random discussion that happened at an event that you were at that I couldn't make it to.
Yeah.
But I thought, it'd be nice to meet. And Michael Roderick had spoken highly of you and he's a friend. And then here we are. And you introduced me to some people. So you just never know. And I think that it's so important to be open and it's fun.
It is fun.
Something that happens at least a half hour talking to somebody,
right.
But I always look at, well, at least I can get a story out of it. It's something. So, and I think, clearly you do that. You don't hesitate to meet somebody and to make an offering, and which is really nice. And it was also really touching to me when I showed you a scene from the play and how I felt your emotion through the internet.
I feel those emotions coming back up right now as you're talking about it. Yeah, that's what I love is somebody else who was pitched to be on my podcast, our friend Michael Roderick, right, knew that I was coming to New York, put together a group of people. It was very last minute, but then he brought a really intentional group of people that he wanted me to meet. And that's then how we got to start our conversations. And hopefully we'll get to meet in person at either one of your, performances or when I come to New York, or if you are in LA or wherever in between. And that's one of the beautiful things. So you've given us a lot to think about, and I think a lot of inspiration. So just thinking about how everything you do helps lead you to the next place. Being open to saying yes and being willing to have conversations with people. And we had our conversation. Neither one of us had any idea where it was going to go. And what we had, we weren't coming in with an agenda, which some people want you to have an agenda when you come into a call. But I think it's really great to be able to be open and just let's learn about each other. Let's see where our connection points are. And I see how that's been one of the big through lines through everything you're doing and why you still have no intention of stopping anytime soon.
No, I don't. And you're exactly right. And it's because it rewards me, with meeting somebody else I like, somebody who's got an interesting story, even if that's the only time we ever talk. but it can also lead to other things.
Yeah.
That all of a sudden there's an ideal project that you bring to me, I bring to you. I meet these people over here. They'd be perfect. You should meet them. And it's, I think, sharing good people, and good people know other good people. And that's how I believe that you also not only build your friends, but also your business associates and that sort of thing, because you find good people through other good people. And I think that's also a big plus. When a friend of mine who was a magician, and he's very, very talented, Eric Walton, and he knew I was writing a play, and he said, you're going to need a general manager, and here's who general managed my play. I think you two ought to meet. And that's my general manager, the first person I hired. When I interviewed a bunch of directors and hired Sheldon Epps, who I thought was fantastic, he said, I want you to meet Shelton Beckton. He's the musical director. He and I've worked together. He's fantastic. And, you meet, again, good people through other good people, plus they have a familiarity.
Right.
So building a community gets to be a lot easier because you have these people in common. And I think that that's very powerful and fun. It's fun.
It is. So building community, being open, seeing the through lines, what's some other advice that you would give to somebody listening right now who's maybe they're looking at their what next? They're just listening to this episode to get a little inspiration to continue going down their path?
I would say a really important thing is to not say no to yourself. If it's something that you want to do, it's something that you are passionate about, that you think you can grow and make happen or whatever. If you start off with the assumption, I don't know if they'd want to talk to me. Well, if you find out by asking them if you can meet with them, you don't write the script in advance and then disqualify yourself. And I think people, unbeknownst, don't really realize how often that they say no to themselves and disqualify themselves. You're going to get plenty of rejection. So don't worry. You'll get lots of that. You're going to get lots of obstacles, lots of people that say no. So don't say no to yourself. Try to move it forward and see if you can make what's important to you happen. I think that's really important. And the other thing is, and this is particularly true with women, it should be true with men too, but it's more true with women, which is having imposter syndrome. And the thing about imposter syndrome, everybody's an imposter, in a certain sense. If your definition is that I'm not really X yet, I haven't achieved X yet, that just means that you're a work in progress. And doesn't mean that you're an imposter. An imposter is somebody who claims to be someone else, and they're trying to con you for some reason. Whether they're trying to con you for money, con you for contacts, they're trying to con you, and they aren't being truthful about what they're putting forth as who they are. That's an imposter. Okay. It is not an imposter that you're trying to do something, you haven't achieved it yet. And don't diminish yourself. You're on a journey. So have that fuel yourself, because the more you learn, the more you know, the more people you meet, the more the odds start tilting in your favor that you can manifest what it is you want to do. Could I call myself a playwright? I wrote a play. Well, now that it's been professionally and commercially produced, I'm a playwright, but I was announcing that beforehand. And from the day that it was produced, the day before, I still called myself a playwright, but I'm a produced playwright now. I'm legitimate on that level. And I think that, again, those are the obstacles we set up for ourselves because we feel insecure about what it is we can do or say. And I just think it's really important to not say no to yourself. You'll get plenty of no's anyhow. Don't think of yourself as an imposter. Think of yourself as someone who's striving to achieve something, and you're on that journey.
Fantastic. Jeffrey, I'm obviously going to link your podcast, your website. Is there anything else that people should be aware of your work, of things that you're going to do next, things they should look out for? Or is the best way to contact you through your website? Through
the website or through LinkedIn, and it's B. Jeffrey Madoff. I post things from my class interviews with really interesting people that have been guests in my class. And it's about entrepreneurship, creativity, leadership, team building, how to get financed,
All
the
the
steps to
important
entrepreneurship, all that kind of stuff. A ton of that stuff. There's my book, Creative Careers, Making a Living with Your Ideas, available at all fine booksellers. And if you read it and like it, please leave a review, because I learned quite a while after I had the book published that the more reviews you get, the more your book gets suggested on Amazon. Who knew? I didn't know the whole game of book publishing at that point.
Same thing with podcasts.
Yeah. And then I was going to say something. Oh, yeah. And then one other thing, just as a curiosity, every day I walk several miles around New York and I take black and white pictures about different city scenes. It can be all kinds of things. And that's Instagram at @BJeffreyMadoff. And you might just find those little city shots, as I call them, and the city life interesting and fun to look at.
Yeah. Well, I know that you and I are going to be having many more long and wonderful conversations. This is just giving the audience a little taste of who you are and all of the fascinating things that you do. Jeffrey, thank you so much for being here on Your Brand Amplified. And I look forward to our next conversation.
I do too. And thank you so much and we're, by the way, a living example of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, this is true.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And thank you to everybody who's watching this episode or listening to it on your favorite platform. Please do leave us a rating review. Let me know what you think. And check out Anything and Everything, the podcast, Jeffrey's books. And I just think that they'll be really helpful and valuable as you continue your journey, whether it's for your personal life, your professional life, or a little bit of everything in between.
Thanks for listening or watching to this episode of Your Brand Amplified. Don't forget to leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast listening platform. And if you want to learn more, check us out at yourbandamplified.com.